Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Joy. Proving the conspiracy theory that is underway, I can categorically assure you that when Boris Johnson was filmed cutting his throat, metaphorically speaking, he was indeed aping the actions of Nick Ferrari and not in any way seeking to sort of surreptitiously redirect the course of the interview. If you don't take my word for that, then you're beyond help. 6 minutes after 10 is the time. What did you think? Possibly the easiest introduction to a programme I've ever done. 1 hour in this studio. The Prime Minister questioned by you and my colleague, and at the end of that hour, I wonder whether, you know what my abiding question is in these circumstances, whether whether any of your needles have been nudged. It's a bit difficult. For what it's worth, I thought that Nick Ferrari did a bang-up job of interviewing the Prime Minister, but it's hard to know what question to ask you that couldn't be construed by unkind minds as some sort of internecine criticism. So, you know, what would you have asked him, or what did you think of that interview as an examination of Boris Johnson? So for you, what did you learn about Boris Johnson? What did you not learn that you would have liked to learn about Boris Johnson? But I want the subject of the interview to be critiqued. That's just a sort of, I think, an important point to begin with. The phone lines are open, 0345 60 60 973. I should offer up a small caveat as we commence by saying that obviously I have to be preparing for my own programme between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, so it's not beyond possibility that you listened even more closely than I managed to. So be gentle with me if there are details and specifics that you're fully across and that you perhaps expect me to be. The reason I just did that kind of weird rearview mirror glance is the stuff about how important it is to focus critiques on the subject of the interview is actually quite straightforward, because the question I want to ask you, now that I've laid out my stall, is whether any of it matters anymore. And I don't mean that in a cynical, world-weary kind of way. I mean that in a Donald Trump on Fifth Avenue kind of way, whether we have actually now, for reasons I don't understand. I have moments of thinking that I do understand, and I have moments of thinking that I'm very close to grasping it, but then it just slips out of reach again. Michael Gove last night. Did you see Michael Gove last night? Turning up for a debate to which he hadn't been invited with a film crew. I don't get it anymore. That seems to me to be either an act of such utterly ridiculous stupidity, such childish absurdity, that, you know what I do in these circumstances? I've been doing it for 3.5 years, so I'll clearly never learn. I begin to think whether there's some secret master plan that's currently beyond our ken. It's quite incredibly like me turning up at Old Trafford on Sunday expecting a game. Seriously, it is that stupid. It'd be like me turning up this morning, locking Nick Ferrari in the toilet, waltzing in here, sitting down and telling Boris Johnson that I'll be conducting the interview after all. It's just absurd for Michael Gove to turn up at Channel 4 last night expecting to take part in something that he hadn't been invited to. And then, of course, Ofcom, I think the fella that's just left the building with the Prime Minister, actually, submit a complaint about what Channel 4 did, which has about as much chance of succeeding, I imagine, as most of the complaints that are submitted to Ofcom about me. But the point is, it's not about expecting a result. It's about giving the base something to shout about. So if and when Boris Johnson fails to turn up for an interview with Andrew Neil, despite the fact that the Labour Party insist they only agreed to Jeremy Corbyn doing that slot because they'd been assured that Boris Johnson would as well, if the BBC then finds itself exposed to possible regulatory problems, then what can happen is that the base, the Boris Johnson supporters, and I think one of the questions we might move towards is what that even means. I mean, apart from him giving you an opportunity to carry on pretending that your Brexit vote wasn't a mistake, what does he actually offer? And the problem being the question of what changes, you know? Gove turns up for an interview that he hasn't been invited to. They submit an Ofcom complaint. Oh, sorry, I'd lost my thread a bit. The reason the Ofcom complaint has been submitted has absolutely nothing to do with any genuine belief that they've breached anything, in my humble opinion, and everything to do with giving the furiously hard of thinking is the politest way I can put it. An opportunity to either fall for the nonsense or pretend that they've fallen for the nonsense, so that when genuine criticisms are levelled at Boris Johnson for not turning up to be interviewed by Andrew Neil, they can somehow shout something about Channel 4. And yeah, but her emails. There you go, I got there in the end. It's just a but her emails. That's what they're doing now. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Johnson met with Steve Bannon. Although, as I've told you a billion times, there's no genius involved in telling people that if they unleash the forces of bigotry and prejudice, ignorance and hatred, then the electoral rewards are high. So enough from me. I'm not going to give you any more. I thought the single mother who rang in was brilliant. I thought that really was a neat addendum to our program yesterday, where we really examined that issue and had a little bit of a retrospective back to the days when Boris Johnson wrote those disgusting words about single mothers, and reminding younger listeners that used to be a regular target for ignorant rabble-rousing, sort of tabloid troublemaking. And it's astonishing how many of my younger colleagues didn't even realise. They do now. Should we crack on? What did you think? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Let's go to Walton on the Hill. Joe is there. Joe, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, mate.
Lifelong Tory supporter.
Lifelong? Do me a favour. You weren't a Tory supporter in kindergarten.
I was. You didn't know my dad.
Go on.
I have to say, completely disheartened after listening to Boris for an hour. Even more disheartened by the fact he's clearly not going to face Andrew Neil, which is a crying shame. So I'm now in a dilemma. I have a Tory party.
Oh, phone line went a bit fun. Phone line's gone south, Joe. I don't know why. It was almost as if someone stuck a muffle over your mouth. Can we get Joe back? Because that was a very interesting introduction and a little bit more detail. We need to be careful about constituencies. Nothing happened there, deliberate. That was an accidental glitch. We need to be a little bit careful about constituencies, but I am very keen to get Joe back. Can we get him back? I'll go to Matthew, who's in Leicester. Matthew, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. I was listening intently to the Prime Minister, trying to see if I could like him a bit more. I can't.
Yes. Why not?
Well, he's lying, if I'm honest. He was talking about the aluminium composite cladding. I was involved in a project 2.5 years ago in his constituency of Uxbridge. He was involved in proponent of a World War II museum called Battle of Britain.
Right.
And the whole building is made of aluminium composite cladding. And he stated, I can quote him word for word, "I do not approve of the stuff. I've always been against it." And he was completely involved in this project. Everything we were doing on the project, I was part of the design team, I did the ventilation and heating system.
Right.
Everything was, would Boris approve? Would Boris approve?
Gosh.
And he was, in my opinion, lying through his teeth about being against aluminium composite cladding. How can we trust this guy?
Well, you move me into an area where you are obviously a lot more qualified than I am to comment. The final question I'm qualified to answer, how can we trust this guy? But for me, that's pretty close to rhetorical. If it's so problematical, why were you involved in using it? Unless I've misunderstood your point.
It's the use of aluminium composite cladding is completely safe when it's up to building reg standards.
Right. Okay.
He is using this situation as a political vehicle.
Right.
At that time, Grenfell hadn't even happened. It was just about to happen.
Oh, okay.
But the project that we were involved in was building regs compliance.
Got you.
But he's using his position and his...
So he's rewritten history there, and you were a witness to it, so you are perfectly placed to make that observation. But you knew that before the interview. Oh, no, you didn't. He said it in the interview.
He said it in the interview,
yes.
And the moment he said it, horribly, it was... Before I could attack him directly, he was about to leave the building.
Yeah, I know how you feel.
Yeah, I just had to ring in and make sure everybody's aware of the tomfoolery and the hoodwinkery, to use his terminology, that he's doing to the population.
Well, I suppose we will assemble a list. We had a lad in from Full Fact, actually. I wonder if we should get him down and go through what he spotted during his live fact-checking, but that will certainly be on the list. I'm going to read something out that I don't fully understand. This doesn't happen very often, but we are obviously in a in a period of intense scrutiny. There are 114 high-rise residential and publicly owned buildings in England that have completed remediation works to remove and replace aluminium cladding. This leaves a total of 321 high-rise residential and publicly owned buildings with ACM cladding systems unlikely to meet building regulations yet to be remediated in England. As I said, and I wasn't being glib, my producer and I have to put a show together, or we have to have conversations, so it's highly likely you were listening even more closely to the interview than we were, and that might be an example of why I felt it was important to mention that at the beginning. That and the fact that, you know, I always tell you the truth. No, this is awkward. A tweet from the economics editor at the BBC, Faisal Islam. He writes, more fake news from @Mr James O.B. Thought we were mates, Faisal. Who used a ridiculous analogy describing Gove at Channel 4 as like him turning up at Old Trafford and getting to play. James must know he would definitely get straight into the current midfield. Back to Joe in Walton-on-Thames. A short-trousered Tory, Joe, but I sense you weren't impressed. You weren't impressed with the contents of the last hour. Tell me why not.
I was hoping that Boris would give me some confidence that he's not just about waffle and lies, but the guy never answers a question straight. You know he's lying, you can tell he's lying, and yet he kind of gets away with it. And you know the reason he won't face Andrew Neil, because Andrew Neil would rip him to shreds.
Well, I don't know that that's true, to be honest. Nick doesn't need me to cover his backside, and frankly, I'm not sure I'm big enough. But the interview was pretty flipping good. So Andrew Neil,
it was really good.
Good, thank you.
It was really good. But Andrew Neil would, I think, take him apart. And
well, he'd probably have more numbers and details and things like that in front of him. But don't forget also that Boris Johnson is a former editor of The Spectator, and Andrew Neil is the chairman of the company that publishes The Spectator, and Dominic Cummings is married to a woman who's currently deputy or commissioning editor at The Spectator. So, I mean, impartiality on air is one thing, but BBC rules are supposed to insist on impartiality off air. Quite how they square that circle, I have not been able to find out. But I take your point. Nick Robinson has a crack at him in a debate-style scenario next week. I think all 7 leaders are there tonight. So it's not so much that I mean, either you wanted him to say stuff you could hang your hat on, things you could trust him on, or you wanted him to be duffed up when he wasn't providing what you wanted. You know what I'm going to say? I mean, have you never come across this Boris Johnson person before? You seem surprised that he has a fragile relationship with the truth.
But I kind of hope that he'd take the hour to actually give some real answers, to lose the waffle and all the bluster.
Yeah.
But he doesn't. Therefore, I come away feeling, do I vote for a man that actually I don't trust and I don't believe in? My alternatives are another man who, whilst some of his policies about addressing social equality are commendable, I don't trust because of the Jewish issue and because I think his spending policies are going to bankrupt us. Or I'm faced with the Lib Dems, where I think they're really, really lightweight. So it comes down to the best of the 3 evils. And I still don't know which way I would go.
Well, there's a lot of it about, oddly, and often the political coverage ignores this simple fact that, in my experience, huge swathes of the country are effectively homeless. What do you think will be the clincher for you? Because once, and this is not a personal criticism of you, Joe, far from it, trust isn't as important to people as I used to think it was, is it? Or honesty?
It is to me, because I want to see a politician with principles. You know, some of the politicians we've had in the past that not everybody agreed with. But, you know, I'd say, you know, somebody like a John Smith, somebody actually who I think was an honest, trustworthy, principled man.
Yes.
That's what I would like to see, but we just don't have them. And that's a crying shame. And I'm of the age now where that's important to me, to believe in somebody I vote for.
How old are you?
Do I have to say on here?
Yeah, it's all right.
I'm 62 now.
No one's listening, Joe. No one's listening.
62, I'll say it quickly. Right?
Okay, you're 62 years old. I feel like you do, but I think of the generation before. I think of sort of a Callaghan and a Healy, and then, you know, the Heseltines and the Ken Clarks, and I've felt for some time that politics no longer attracts the calibre of candidate that perhaps we both grew up with, despite there being some decade and a half between us, Joe.
There's decade and a half. There is only one answer, and that is I need to get into politics. I need to run myself.
Your country needs you, Joe. Seriously.
Absolutely.
I'll see you at the dispatch box. 23 minutes after 10 is the time. Stuart is in, let's get this right, Seaton Sluice in Northumberland. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Morning.
Hello. What did you think of all that?
Oh, God, to be honest, James, I think this might be a little bit of talking therapy with yourself this morning.
Well, that's what I'm. It's usually the other way around, but I'm happy to help.
I know. I'm just so totally. I mean, I'm consumed not only by this election, but the last 3 or 4 years, I've just become deeper and deeper into it. So I feel like I'm across everything. I feel like, I listen to you guys, I listen to all of the different outlets and get a broad understanding. And to be honest, that could well be Boris's last, major appearance.
Solo it could be. There are debates planned with other leaders, and whether or not he does any other interviews one-on-one remains to be seen.
Exactly, and he's ruling out Andrew Neil there tonight. I think this Rishi Sunak and Rebecca Long-Bailey will go for Labour, so they're not quite leaders.
Oh, is that right? I didn't realise that.
Yeah,
okay.
Next week.
God, you're right. I nearly had a little swing at you then when you said because I'm the biggest hypocrite on the planet when it comes to boasting and showing off. When you said you were really across everything, I nearly gave it a bit of I, and then there you are schooling me on what's actually happening tonight on the telly in the political debate.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. But to be honest, I'm having nightmares, James. I'm upset. Last night, I was in my actual dream. I was crying because my family, my friends, were telling me that they're all voting Conservatives,
right?
And that and they've been, and it's just codswallop. You listen to him there today, particularly on his comments in the past, and he'll disassociate himself straight away and say, you know what, that's 20 years ago, and he's nothing is sticking, and I don't like the fact that the narrative of this election is about who's the worst.
Nothing is sticking. Rock and a hard place, lesser of two evils. I think of all of that, nothing is sticking is fascinating. Why is that?
He's very good, isn't he? And you look at the stunt last night and the team that he's got around him. The stunt last night.
But do your mates fall for that? Do the people that had you weeping in your dreams fall for that? Michael Gove turns up for an interview he hasn't been invited to with a film crew. He's a former journalist. He will be under no illusions whatsoever about how despicable it is to seek to subvert and undermine a free media in that way. But you think, because I look at it and think, well, no one's going to fall for that. And then I look at America and I think, actually, the great public can fall for anything. But you think your peers would fall for that stunt and think that Channel 4 have emerged from that episode badly or bruised in some way?
I think, James, it's a long game, and that will be something which will be repeated, over the next few days.
Because the truth doesn't matter. All that matters is that they've got something in their hands to wave, and that's why the parallel with her emails during the entire Trump campaign in retrospect seems so significant, utterly meaningless, but halls full of people shouting it.
Exactly, and what's upsetting is that it completely dilutes democracy, and the important things are just not there anymore, and people are not bothered about the important things, about the policies. Last night, and to a certain degree, what Johnson will say today is, what, we're not talking about the climate, and absolutely we're not talking about the climate, but you're totally responsible for that, and the way that him and his team are approaching this election, they don't want to talk about the issues.
There's an interesting article. I worry it might invade tonight's slumber, so I'm loath to recommend it to you, but De Smog, a very interesting sort of investigative journalism outfit. They've got some very interesting stuff about links between the kind of business people that make a lot of money out of what you describe and some branches of British politics. What given your dismay overnight, what could have put a smile on your face in the course of that interview, if anything?
I think, a smile on my face would have been, maybe I'm entrenched, and actually I think about what could Johnson have said, what could he have done that would have put a smile on my face. And actually I don't think there is anything. I think what could have put a smile on my face is, and that, to a certain degree, your first 3 or 4 callers is starting to pick me up a little bit, because people maybe won't see through it. You're getting people calling up, and certainly Conservative voters, whether they're lifelong kindergarten voters or whatever, but they're saying they're not convinced by it.
I don't know that the what you might call the rump or the real kind of bovine base. This isn't necessarily their first port of call for a radio program. Sensible, thoughtful Conservatives like Joe, obviously, are kind enough to listen, but for a lot of people, there's a line that haunts me, mate. Like your dreams are haunted, and it's this: I know he's a liar, but it really winds up people like you, and that's why I like him. Now, admittedly, that caller to the programme was talking about Donald Trump, but it's stayed with me, that contribution, because, well, at the moment, it's the only way you can make sense of people cheering for a fella who is lying to them. And then you're back to Joe's observation, very valid observation, that even if Boris Johnson is not doing enough to woo you, to seduce you, actually that's a bad example, then it doesn't necessarily render any of his opponents any more attractive. 10:28 is the time. Thank you, Stuart. Eli is in Jerusalem. Eli, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'm first-time caller.
You're very welcome.
I have heard that Boris Johnson won Eton's best debater.
Did he?
I heard, I may have read that in his autobiography or something like that.
Yeah, go on.
But I have one question. Whenever he does an interview, I want to vote Conservative due to the fact that I don't really have anywhere else to vote for.
Yes.
But he makes it so hard because every time you ask him a question, to quote him, he either dithers or delays and stutters and bluffers every answer. If he would just answer the question slowly and clearly and actually say a point that someone can actually believe, it would do so much better for him.
Yes. Just without any political axes to grind, why do you think he so routinely fails to do that?
I don't know, because you would expect that he is meant to be a great politician and a great debater.
Well, is he, though? I mean, I don't... I mean, I can see why, if you've read his autobiography, you might have come away with the idea that he was possessed of spectacular gifts. But apart from a couple of shifts presenting Have I Got News for You, where is the evidence that he's any of those things?
Because I'm saying he does have influence on, like, loads of people. Loads of people seem to
but I don't care about them. I only care about you. Where did you get the idea that he was a gifted orator?
I don't know, maybe it was because he supposedly marches himself from Winston Churchill and all that.
Well, I could say that I model myself on Yoda. It wouldn't necessarily give me the ability to lift X-Wing fighters out of the swamp, would it? I mean, where did you get the evidence? I'm not having a go, I promise. I'm just really intrigued because it's never really occurred to me before that this narrative very rarely gets challenged, you know. Oh, he's great at this and he's a great orator and he's brilliant at that and he's all good at the other, and he isn't, is he really, Eli?
Yeah, this is really the point, because I have this, like, thought that originally, like, Boris Johnson, out of everyone, is the best speaker and all that.
Yeah. I'm
just like, he's not actually, if you listen to him talk, a very good speaker.
Well, I'll tell you what he'd be good at, oddly, and I did debating at school myself, and I've got a certificate to prove I was a national champion. I don't know whether he does. There's a big difference between a set-piece speech that has them roaring in the aisles and the cut and thrust of detailed debate, which I think is perhaps the thing he isn't any cop at all. Thank you, mate. A lovely call. Eli in Jerusalem, where we continue our contemplation of the last hour of Nick Ferrari's show this morning. What? Haven't you got your own topics? Yeah, he had the Prime Minister in, all right? Calm down, Princess. What did you think of it? 0345 606 0973. Not great critics so far, including people clearly minded ordinarily to vote for the Conservative Party. I don't know if the kind of people who swallow whatever they serve up will ring me today. Perhaps there is actually a line over which you will not cross. Perhaps we don't have our own little version of Trump's Fifth Avenue observation unfolding in Britain at the moment. I'd have probably liked to have had a crack at him on the questions of checks in the Irish Sea, because as far as I can remember, we're still looking at a Prime Minister directly and routinely contradicting the Secretary of State for leaving the European Union, which makes all these promises. We had a little game in the office whenever he said, get Brexit done. We rang a little bell. Kind of do that thing off air now. Maturity has led me to a place where I don't do that sort of thing on air anymore. But you sort of contemplate that possibility and wonder whether actually, if you've just listened to that for an hour, you're still going to vote for him. But the last thing I'm going to do is ring up and tell James why I think it went well. But all his interviews are like that, in some ways. And, of course, the question we began asking a few weeks ago, is the one that is probably still the most pertinent of all, which is, from Boris Johnson's past, his personal or professional life, what would you point at as evidence that he can be trusted? And, you know, Nick, quite rightly, went in on the trust issue time and time and time again, right up to that question. How many children have you got? Didn't get an answer. Astonishing, really, that a man can write such pejorative, vile nonsense about single mothers and somehow feel that he's not compelled to provide voters with evidence of his own parenting skills. Quite incredible, actually. It doesn't involve telling Nick Ferrari how many children you have fathered is not dragging your children into the public sphere. It's a number. It doesn't need names and star signs. Quite incredible that a party I grew up not being a particular supporter of, but certainly having a much warmer view of than perhaps I do today, because I felt that it was the party of kind of morality and family values. Don't laugh at me, all right? I just did. I just thought, you know, you always look for common ground with people. So you might disagree with right-wing friends about the distribution of wealth, for example, or, you know, trade unions. But you always thought that, well, at least they're solid on marriage. At least they're solid on stability, domestic stability. Yeah, of course they are. Ian Duncan Smith set up a charity, didn't he? Claiming to support marriage. And yet here he is, cheering his funny little face off for a man who makes an absolute mockery of fidelity and won't even reveal how many children he's got. So there it is, of course. That's the mistake I made growing up. People like that don't actually care about marriage and morality in their own milieu. They just think it's a good way of keeping the lower orders in their place. Yes, like taxes, really. Morals are for the poor. 0345 606 0973 to provide me with your critique of Boris Johnson's appearance on this radio station this morning. Yvonne is in Leeds. Yvonne, what would you like to say? No, I think I've sent Yvonne to sleep. Chris is in Seend in Wiltshire. Chris, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. Thank you for having me on the show.
Very welcome.
I've been listening to you about 6 months and thoroughly enjoyed.
Thank you. It's very kind.
He just trots out the same sort of cliches every time. That get Brexit done, and he just...
That doesn't even mean anything, does it? I don't want to have a Brexit argument this morning, but get Brexit done is even more fatuous than Brexit means Brexit. It's quite incredible, especially when he doesn't even know how many trade agreements we are currently negotiating. That's just remarkable, but this is where I fight the urge to do every programme, Chris, asking, does any of it matter anymore? Because he doesn't even know how many trade agreements we've got, but he keeps swearing blind we'll get it done at the end of next January. It's just insane.
I know, quite. A question for you. Do you think that anything he says or does in any of these interviews will make any difference to the people who are going to vote for it?
Well, not to all the people that are going to vote. There are certainly some who will vote for him, you know, even if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue, so to speak. and I do think, and I made no secret of this over the years, that if Labour was led by anybody else, and that includes Orville the Duck and Nookie Bear, anybody else, then people would find it a hell of a lot easier to contemplate voting Labour. But yeah, I do. I think that I tell you what I think, and it's only... I sound like a Spice Girl. I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want. I think the polling, the constituency modelling, is a reminder that Remain-leaning Conservatives are possibly the most important voters in the country. And I think that to generalise hugely about Remain-leaning Conservatives, they've probably mostly reached a point where they're more spooked by Corbyn than they are by leaving, right?
Yeah, I understand that.
So the polling that sort of suggests Corbyn can't be Prime Minister might tempt Remain-leaving Conservatives to actually vote for a candidate that is more likely to help deliver a second referendum. And the more inadequate Johnson seems, and perhaps dishonest and disingenuous can be added to that list, perhaps the easier it will be for constituency-specific decisions to be made by that constituency of voters.
Yeah, I can see that. The only thing is, where I can't mention where I am, but they'd elect a lampstand of the Tory party if necessary here.
Yeah, and that's true in a lot of constituencies, and of course the other way round as well. And that is one of the great failings of our first past the post system, isn't it?
Yeah. Indeed.
That's the problem. And being homeless is a bit of a trite phrase. A lot of us trot it out, but it's quite a profound problem. And it's a relatively recent one for reasons I don't fully understand. I guess the rise of the Scot Nats in Scotland has changed parliamentary arithmetic pretty profoundly, but I never really felt that, even when I did it at A-level, we studied electoral reform. It was quite a big deal, but a bit anarchy. And I just never really saw the urgency that some people saw. And of course, I think that the campaign against changing the voting system was led by the same fellow that led the campaign to leave the European Union. You can make of that what you will. 10:43 is the time. Simon is in a workshop. Simon, what made you pick up the phone?
Good morning, James. First time calling in. Bear with me.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
It's the fury one particular thing that Boris put out there this morning. You're fully aware of the floods that happened in Worksop and Doncaster.
Of course I am.
And Boris trotted out that each household would receive £5,000.
Yes.
That's demonstrably untrue. Each household affected has received £500, and each small and medium-sized enterprise has received £2,500. £500 isn't enough to cover the insurance excess in most cases. You know, the whole saying £5,000 makes you think that's a pretty decent wedge. People can make a start on replacing possessions, etc. on that. No, that's just is not the case.
Well, again, this is your world, not mine. You're much closer to the story than I am, so I've got no reason to doubt what you're saying. Could you swallow a slip of the tongue defence or a little kind of just statistical snafu?
Yeah, if it was an isolated occurrence, then yes, absolutely. But it's all the time. It's in every interview. It was several times during that interview. He doesn't know how many he doesn't know how many agreements there are.
Well, being negotiated. I don't think there are any agreements yet. He doesn't know how many agreements are being negotiated. And you're right. I've just double checked. I mean, the first thing I can find, or my producer can find, is a report saying that households can claim up to £700. So that tallies pretty much with what you're saying. Presumably, there's an average or something.
I'm reading verbatim from the doncaster.gov.uk site.
Yeah.
So if that's not right, nothing's right.
I'll say fairer than that, can you, Simon? How do you think, and, questions like this are inevitably loaded, but I'd love to know what your answer to it is, nonetheless, because I don't know anymore. How does he get away with it? You care about that, right? I care about that. I've been caring about the nonsense Boris Johnson tells voters since the last round of industrial action by firefighters. That was my birth in a political sense. How do you think he gets away with it?
I've asked the very same question. So just a bit of background. I come from I personally come from a strong Labour family, but yes. my better half, very, very much Tory.
Yes.
And the father-in-law is a mystery to me. As far as he's concerned, I mean, he's an intelligent guy.
Yes.
But as far as he's concerned, it's all a media stitch-up, and Boris is the only man that can get the job done. And
the job done being Brexit.
Yeah.
And he still presumably couldn't tell you why that's a good idea anymore, because all of the reasons he was given in the run-up to the referendum by Boris Johnson, chiefly, have turned out not to be true, and yet he's still there swallowing the snake oil. That I don't want to insult your father-in-law any more than you have already, but that just doesn't make sense, does it? It's really, really strange.
The conversations tend to peter out, and I just give 1,000-yard stare when I turn up with facts.
Have a great Christmas, won't you, Simon?
Cheers, James.
There's a book you can get. No, stop it, James. What did you think of the Prime Minister's rare interview? You have to say that, don't you? I kind of don't have 20/20 hindsight, or I don't have full recall of these matters, but I think 2010 was the first leaders' debate in the sense of. Do you remember that one? I agree with Nick. Yeah, crikey. God, it feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? The notion of interviews and debates and interactions, probably, I sense a growing consensus that it should come under some sort of official organisation rather than be left to horse trading, really, between broadcasters and political parties, just as it is in America. I think that seems to me to be one way forward, probably the best way forward. But as things stand, we deal with the world as it is, and LBC secured the interview that every organisation in the country wants. Nick Ferrari conducted it in characteristically robust fashion, and I'm interested in how you felt Boris Johnson, if you want to use a public school friendly analogy, what did you think of Boris Johnson's innings? Nick tried everything, a bit of spin, a couple of googlies, a few fast ones, left arm round the wicket. He tried the lot. What did you think of... I would say that he got Boris Johnson out at least 4 times. But of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? What would you say? Alison's in Maidstone. Alison, what would you like to say?
Hi, yeah. Well, I listened to the interview with much interest.
Yes.
My big concern is that the Conservatives' theoretic during this whole campaign is to discredit Jeremy Corbyn with various antics that he's supposedly done in the past and how we shouldn't trust him because he called Hamas friends, even though the dialogue in Parliament is to always call someone an honourable friend, whether you like them or not. And yet here we have the Prime Minister...
I don't know if it was just in Parliament that he did it, but...
No, but I'm saying that word is not offered...
Can I give you a better example?
Doesn't necessarily mean friend.
No, can I give you a better example? Because I agree with you about that. It is something that keeps coming back round again and again and again and again. And I'm always reminded of how when Mahatma Gandhi wrote to Adolf Hitler, do you know how he began the letter?
No.
Dear friend.
Right.
So I don't know whether that means Mahatma Gandhi was a secret Nazi, but you're right to point out that...
So I'm, and of course he used it in the interview with Nick, saying, "Oh, he's a terrorist friend," and,
right.
And he's
I missed that bit. Forgive me.
Russia and he's friends with Putin and all this, and yet here we have a Prime Minister who has written word on paper, saying various things, and then he has the audacity to tell us that because he wrote it 25 years ago, that we should forget about it.
Yes.
We're not allowed to forget about what Jeremy Corbyn did in the past.
Oh, I see. That's the disingenuousness. Is judge me by my present, judge my opponent by his past.
Exactly.
I hadn't picked
he
up on that.
asks us to trust him with the hands of our planet. And for me, I lay in bed every night crying my eyes out at the thought of having another Conservative government whose plans are to wait until 2050, when most of them will be dead, and have no regard for what is going to happen to my children's future. That terrifies me. And when people talk about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, no one is realising how much danger we are in with the climate, and that terrifies me more than anything in the world. And I don't mean to be emotional about this. I'm normally really calm. But
you're very welcome to be emotional.
2 weeks left for this, and if they get in, even if they get in for 5 years, by 2024, the damage, we won't be able to go back. We won't be able to go back. And I meant to tell my 2 young children that the rest of the country said it's okay that your planet is destroyed because he's a liar and we don't care. I have a very good friend who is involved in politics, and she told me that, politicians have always been accused of kind of lying now and then, but the danger is now that people know and they don't care.
Or they kind of have there's a weird ability to put it out of your mind. And I used to have a theory, and for what it's worth, I know a lot of people, both in my working life and my personal life, who share your terror, and I use that word advisedly. Can I ask you a question? Would you mind? Have you done the Extinction Rebellion course? Have you?
Yeah,
I knew it.
I've been at every single one with my children.
I knew it's impossible to be exposed to that. It's almost an hour long, isn't it? That lecture that they're almost doing it like a pyramid scheme.
I actually give the lecture myself.
I knew it.
Every time I give the lecture, I cry my eyes out because it's terrifying knowing what animals are already dying.
But you know what they say? Dying. I don't know about you, and I won't inquire after your age, it would be very ungallant, but a lot of these phrases that are kind of pithy little proverbs when you're growing up, and you don't actually really understand why they're pithy little proverbs, because when you're a kid, they don't make much. Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, well, I was in school in the 80s, so it isn't ignorance is bliss. I was in school in the 80s, and we were talking about climate change then.
No, I know, but people who need a shake, sending in messages now like crocodile tears, lol, or hysterical ain't the word. That is the blissful ignorance that politicians...
Still have denying it's happening. I still have people telling me that I'm ridiculous. I actually held a climate hustings in my local area at the beginning of the week, and I had a candidate who stood in front of 90 people and said, climate change is a hoax and the government are just doing it to get tax off of you. So,
and there it is. And who funds that? Who funds that School of thought? Of course we don't know, because the organisations that they bankroll won't disclose who their donors are. But if you were to speculate about things like taxes on sugar or attempts to reduce fossil fuel burning, carbon emissions, almost anything, actually. It's remarkable how they all end up not just under the same umbrella, but in many cases registered at the same address. Thank you, Alison. And I respect and admire your emotion, for the record. We've already spoken to Yvonne in Leeds, I think, haven't we, at 10:56? Is this a different Yvonne in Leeds, or did we not spot... Yvonne in Leeds, have I already spoken to you?
Not today, no. Nobody has, no.
But you're my second Yvonne in Leeds of the morning. Unless I've gone mad. Anyway, Yvonne, what's on your mind? Yeah, Yvonne, well, my love, you need to turn your radio off in the background.
Ah, that's a good idea.
Yes, that's why they tell you to do it.
Right, sorry.
That's all right. You carry on.
I want to talk about the Russian report.
Yes.
I want to know why he hasn't been brought to justice on this. He's got to deliver it. Well, I mean...
Do you notice what he does? Actually, this is the third time I've noticed this. He gets asked about because there's two strands to this report. One looks into the meddling or attempts to meddle in the election and the referendum specifically. Now, that's going to be almost impossible to prove, because even if you've got bang-to-rights evidence that they tried to meddle, no one's going to actually admit that they were manipulated by the things that the Russians did or did not do. So Boris Johnson always, when he's asked about it, says, I have seen no evidence at all of the Russians successfully meddling. Sometimes he forgets to say successfully. But he wasn't asked about that. That's the weirdest thing. He's asked about the donors, because the second strand of the report is the amount of dirty, stolen Russian money reportedly passed into the pockets of British politicians, not confined to any single party, that frankly should never have even been allowed into the country, let alone into the pockets of politicians. And he never answers that bit. So he gets asked, why won't you tell us about the donors in the report? He says, I haven't seen any evidence of meddling. Now that, it might just be me being a bit weird, but that to me speaks volumes.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
Why do you think he won't publish it?
Sorry?
Why do you think he won't publish it?
Well, he'll have to attend a meeting, a debate on this, won't he? And he won't be able to answer.
So it may come out after the election, by which point it's almost like it's almost like a busted flush, isn't it?
Yeah, it's too. So we can't do much about that then.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that is the question I dare not ask, really. There's so much despair and disillusion and so much disingenuousness from the politicians that you do have moments of wondering where it leads, or indeed where it ends. Yvonne, thank you. It's coming up to 10:59. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I shall squeeze in one more before the news headlines. Peter is in Oxford. Peter, what did you make of it all?
Hello, James. Yes, I think he's shown his true colours. I mean, he's come across, as he always does, as waffly, inept and mendacious. I'm in the health service, and when they come to talk about nurses and doctors, they clearly haven't got the sums right. He talks about these 50,000 nurses, of whom 19,000, it turns out, are already in post. And you can't see that that's actually dishonest. In terms of, actually, how are they going to employ another 31,000 nurses without scouring countries outside Europe that need them badly, like India and the Philippines? And that has been the trend. We're losing our European nurses and doctors. If they can be replaced at all, it'll be from countries that need them, and they're not going to affect with Brexit and recruitment problems in... So
freedom of movement...
developing countries is awful.
It's freedom of movement is a very different thing from a kind of recruitment drive, isn't it?
It's not just that. I mean, you can't train people. In the case of GPs like me, for example, if they started to recruit them now, they'll be in post in 2031. So saying you're going to recruit GPs from within the UK is nonsense. And the crisis in the health services now, I mean, you hear it every day. Hospitals, general practice, people can't get appointments for several weeks.
Yes.
And I deeply regret the fact that as a GP I have trouble offering appointments, but the demand is overwhelming. And on the sums, when he talks about, well, the manifesto talks about, and Boris Johnson has not gone back on this, 6,000 more GPs, God knows where they'll come from, offering 50 million appointments a year. Now, do the sums. That's 47 appointments per day per GP, even if they all work full time.
I haven't got my abacus with me at the moment.
Obviously, the trouble is that before they made these pronouncements, they should have done their sums. So is it ineptitude?
I've got to go to the news, Peter. Yes, no, I mean, you're the second or third caller to just do some counting. Remarkable that it's come to this, really. Just do some counting, and then you can decide who's telling the truth and who isn't. And I'm just trying to dig out the relevant clip, but that misspeak, if it was a misspeak, from the Prime Minister on the amount of compensation offered to families in places like Worksop and Doncaster, devastated by flooding, of course, last month. I can't help remembering the time that Diane Abbott got her numbers wrong in an interview with Nick, which is still spoken of in hallowed tones in Conservative corridors. So we've got the local advice, which is £500 for households and £2,500 for businesses, and I think we've got the clip of what Boris Johnson said on this radio station just over an hour ago.
What I will say is that this government has stood ready, done everything we can to help the victims of flooding, both in our community support schemes, our business support schemes. We have £5,000 available for every household that's been damaged.
I can't find any evidence for that claim, which doesn't mean that it's not there. Obviously, we're turning on a sixpence here. But the remarkable notion of a Prime Minister either not knowing or misleading people over a national emergency that he was roundly criticised for not properly recognising as a national emergency. So let's look for some good bits if we can find them. What went well, do you think, for the Prime Minister? 6 minutes after 11 is the time. David is in Chelsea. David, what would you like to say?
I'd just like to say that I find your attitude incredibly patronising.
Right, I've barely started, David, but we're not talking about me. We're talking about Boris Johnson. What do you think went well
Boris
for?
Johnson apart. You asked a specific question about Boris Johnson. How does he get away with it?
Yes.
He gets away with it because he's got a certain amount of charm.
Right.
Whether good or bad, if you like him or don't like him...
Sorry, he gets away with what?
Gets away with telling lies, according to you.
Well, no, not according to me.
Well, according to the general consensus, then, if you like.
Yes.
Not according to Boris Johnson. He's not telling lies as far as he's concerned.
Right.
Now, every politician in my life has told lies. Everybody. They all tell lies. Tony Blair was one of the biggest liars.
Yes.
Okay? It's nothing new. You have to go through it yourself and to decide what
so, listen,
what you think is true or not true.
Well, I don't think we do. We don't decide what is true and what is not true, David. That's kind of the point. But I'd hate to patronise you.
What I mean was, who is telling the truth?
Yes, but that's not what you said. But I don't want to patronise you. So tell me what you think went well in the interview this morning.
I think his charm comes across.
No, I'm not interested in his charm. I'm interested in the content of the interview.
The content of the interview?
Yes.
I didn't listen to all of it. I only listened to parts of it.
Well, that's all right. The parts that you heard.
Halfway through.
The parts that you heard.
I don't think anything came out particularly well.
Oh.
I don't think any politician comes across particularly well in this election. But one thing I would like to say is I'm not voting for Boris Johnson. I'm voting for a front.
Well, hang on. Yeah. We're not interested in how you're voting during the election period because there are constituency issue specifics that we're not allowed to broadcast. So.
But you're implying that Boris Johnson is president of the UK.
Right,
We're
David,
not voting for Boris Johnson, are we?
Well, OK. I'm not quite sure what to say to you, David. You sound very angry, but you're not entirely sure what you're angry about.
I'm not angry. I just find that your attitude a bit patronising.
Yes, but some people...
And it's very easy when you're not accountable yourself.
Some people feel patronised when they've been made to feel silly.
Well, that's Nick Ferrari. Should have come across with that. He should have said, "Look, I'm feeling silly with your answers."
No. I was talking about you.
But Nick, I wasn't conducting an interview. If I was conducting an interview, I might have asked different questions.
But how do you know? You didn't hear it. How can you criticise Nick?
The bits. Now you're being patronising.
No, I'm not being patronising. You're being silly. That was the point I was making.
That's what I mean about you being patronising.
That's what I mean about you being silly.
No, you love that, don't you?
What?
Telling people they're silly.
Pardon?
You love telling people they're silly.
Only silly people.
Oh, God. Look, listen.
No. Carla's in Seven Oaks. Carla, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Carla. What did you think of that?
I am exceptionally
hugely underwhelmed by his interview, especially around the climate change issues.
Do you not find that the charm somehow diffuses the dishonesty and the ignorance?
Oh. It does not wash with me.
I don't want to patronise you, Carla, but surely the charm outweighs the dishonesty, doesn't it?
No, I am a northerner and you can see through that stuff. It makes me so angry. Out of any leader we've ever had, I hate him more than any.
Well,
for
that's
that
a
reason,
bit strong.
Because he thinks he can get away with it with his personality. Yeah. I just basically want to say
well, he can. Our last caller proved it. So, I mean, you go back to that notion, they're all liars, they're all as bad as each other. Well, hang on a minute, this he couldn't lie straight in bed. He's got a history of lying that's as long as his arm. He got fired from his first job for making up quotes from his own godfather. But then, your man in Chelsea thinks he's really charming and that they all lie, so he's essentially explaining why he likes being lied to. But, of course, when you point that out to him and he ends up feeling silly, he just gets all rude and angry. So some people like being lied to, Carla. I bet there are some politicians you'd like being lied to by.
Not really, but it's about I think it's about exposing the lies. I think that's the problem that we've got at the moment. I think that Boris is doing a very good job of dodging the interviews. So, around the issue of not turning up on Channel 4 climate debate last night.
I'm going to say it again. I think you're underestimating his immense charm.
No. I think him not being there speaks volumes, but I would have preferred to have seen him there under scrutiny. I want his climate change policies scrutinised for the whole nation to see, because from that interview alone, I think we can quite clearly see that he is underprepared. He's not knowledgeable about the issue, and he's certainly. But
it doesn't matter, does it? Because
it doesn't matter to him because
but it doesn't matter it doesn't matter to a lot of voters.
But I think it does. 85% of the country are now concerned about climate change. It is up there. 85% is quite a huge number. We want to hear him. We want to see him.
They don't make these decisions in isolation. They turned up. They elected not to turn up at Channel 4 last night. They elected to try to distract from the failure to turn up by sending Michael Gove to sell another little slice of his soul.
Ministers, I personally want to see him in a chair, squirming under the pressure. I want to see his policies scrutinised, and I want to see him. I want to see in his eyes. I want to see the passion that he's got.
Well, you lead me.
Kids' future.
Yeah, you lead me to a question that I often find myself wondering, and about both of the main leaders. Actually, I see Corbyn. I know what he believes in, but I see him as an oppositionist. His whole career is determined and defined by many ways in what he is against. But I've got no idea what Boris Johnson believes in, because what he said he believed in when he was running to be Mayor of London is about 6 million miles away from what he apparently believes in, or what he claimed to believe in, while seeking both to bring about a leave vote in the referendum result and in his campaign to become Prime Minister. What do you think? I mean, hand on heart, and don't give me a glib answer. And I'd like you to try to give a positive answer, you've used the word hate, which is quite strong. Obviously, it puts...
I've got 2 kids, and I was speaking to them last night, and even them, my 4-year-old is like, Mummy, sounds like a baddie. Why doesn't he want to save our future? If a 4-year-old can work that out, climate change. The rest of the nation can't work that out.
Do you know? I wonder whether by the time of the next election, climate change will have assumed the prominence that
it'll be too late by then.
You know that, and I know that. But it is not going to be a clincher in this debate, in this election. I just don't think it is.
It has to be.
Well, I hear you. But anyway, final question: what does he stand for?
Lies and selfishness.
No, I did say try to be positive, Carla.
Well, like you say,
what does he believe in?
He just keeps avoiding being interviewed. We go.
What does he believe in?
We don't know, because he doesn't stand up and talk about what he believes in.
He's been in the public eye for 20 years. Must believe in something.
My husband said the other day, and I love this description, it's like when you ask your kid if they've eaten chocolate, and they say no, and they've got chocolate written all over their face.
Do you know what it was for us? It was pick your own strawberries for me. There's a Polaroid photograph somewhere of me at the weighing station at Pick Your Own Strawberries in Chattersley Corbett, just outside Kidderminster, and I was asked whether I'd actually eaten any strawberries by the farmer. And I said no, and there's a photograph of me in a white T-shirt that is at least 65% pink.
There you go, that's Boris Johnson all over then.
I grew up, thankfully. There's an argument perhaps to be made that little Boris never did. Carla is in Sevenoaks. My apologies for patronising you, Carla. Candy is in Burwash. Candy, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Hello.
Morning.
What a great name.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. What would you like to say, Candy?
Not very charming by in relative terms, but
no.
Hey.
Carry on.
What I want to say is, I know that there was a lot of comments today about trust. He was lying, and he's not honest, and he's not answering questions. I have come to the conclusion this is a consistent behaviour that we all know, and not being a trained psychologist, I think it's not just the integrity or honesty issue anymore. It actually could be being confident enough or having the courage to do that.
Right.
And for someone who is actually fighting for the position that is going to run one of the major countries in the world, having access to some of that sort of thing, to make big decisions, to stand up for the country, that is actually quite a big warning sign to me, because he doesn't seem to like fighting up front. He likes to do things in the background. Maybe diplomatically that's very clever, but do we really want someone like that to represent the country who has had
it depends.
Very good history in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it does genuinely depend on the circumstances. There are probably circumstances in which sending Boris Johnson into the room would actually be the best thing imaginable for Britain. I'm struggling to imagine that room, but if it had Donald Trump in it, for example, then... And we were seeking to I can't keep it up. No, you're right. In what possible circumstances would you say, I know who we need, send for Boris Johnson?
You raise a very important point about
first time for everything.
So charming.
Yes.
He can delight a lot of people.
That wasn't me. That was David in Chelsea, who doesn't mind being lied to as long as the man is charming.
I had the exact same debate with someone yesterday. I said, look, I don't know what charming means to everybody. I don't believe in those things personally, but even though he is not charming, he is lying through the whatever. What happens, people probably is believing is, as long as he's not going to sell out our country, he can do whatever he wants.
Well, he might sell our country, of course. That's the other problem. I mean, not literally, but in terms of trade negotiations with, for example, the United States of America, it's very, very, very hard to see how anyone could reasonably conclude that we will be negotiating from a position of strength, given recent events. 11:16 is the time. On the subject of charm, because it's on the table now. I fell for Boris Johnson's charm. He is charming, but I didn't fall for Boris Johnson's charm to such a degree that I would forgive Boris Johnson's lies. I didn't really appreciate Boris Johnson's lies until after I'd fallen for his charm. And I'm here to tell you, actually, I sound like a televangelist. Brothers and sisters, I'm here to tell you, you can move towards the light. So I fell for Boris Johnson's charm during his mayoralty, the first mayoral election that he stood in. I fell for it completely. I fell for the stuff about asylum for illegal immigrants, an amnesty, I beg your pardon, for illegal immigrants, all the stuff about... I believed him when he talked very, very passionately about how important European Union membership was. All of that stuff. But also the charm. I've told you before, that he is... Well, he isn't now, but back then, in his pomp... If you were walking up Charing Cross Road, as I was a couple of times, and he's coming towards you on his bicycle and he spots you and he shouts, "Hello, comrade," like that. He just sort of a little bit like... I'm not, for example, one of the people mystified by his success with women. I get that charm. But the point at which you say, I don't mind being lied to, because A, he's charming, or B, it winds up people like you, that's the point at which you have surrendered something really, really valuable. I'm just here to remind you that you can, if you want, get it back. It's 21 minutes after 11. My thanks to Corpsey, who's listening on the LBC app and has somehow managed to cross the streams of bearded buffoonery, because the advert that Corpsey has got on the app at the moment is that Specsavers advert with the fella who looks like me. Apparently looks like me. I don't see it myself. I think I look more like the bloke in Vikings. But you know, the one where the fella his eyesight is so bad that he's about to operate on a furry hat? No? Oh, I don't know why I bother. Just trying to put a smile on your face on this otherwise slightly depressing morning. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. I say it's a slightly depressing morning. Glance at my television screen. There's Michael Gove. Lewis is in Oxford to raise the tone. Lewis, what would you like to say?
Yes, good morning, James.
Hello,
I'm just making a point around the support for the people affected by the flood in Doncaster.
Yes.
I don't want anyone to be under the misapprehension that Boris Johnson misspoke. Because actually, on the leaders' debate on ITV last week, he made the very same point, and I was screaming at the radio as I was listening to it.
I misunderstood you. I thought that he was right, and that's what you were saying, that he hadn't misspoke. But instead, you're saying he didn't misspeak because he must have done it on purpose, given that he's done it before.
Absolutely. I think it's a deliberate misguiding, along with lots of other of the hospitals.
But why would that? I mean, the hospitals, the nurses, they don't need to lie. If they announce 31,000 new nurses, that still sounds great. Why say 50? Yeah, if they announce 4 new hospitals, it sounds great. Why announce 40? £500 doesn't sound great, but it's so... Do you know how much of a snowflake I am, Lewis? Even in the context of this absolute jamboree of political cynicism, even when you get heartbreaking calls from apparently educated people somehow trying to excuse weapons-grade lying on the grounds of personal charm, I look at something like that today, and we still haven't pinned it down completely. If there is a £500 payout and the Prime Minister is claiming people got £5,000, I just can't believe it's deliberate. We've just spoken to Doncaster Council, for the record, who said it absolutely is not £5,000. It is a standard 500 for all. And you, Lewis, are adamant that he's said it before, so he should have and probably would have been corrected.
Well, he wasn't corrected at the time, and I don't buy for the bumbling, misspeaking approach either. I believe absolutely doing it in the full knowledge of misleading.
But this is what I mean by my snowflakery, is that I can't quite conceive of cynicism so abject that I will reach for the benefit of the doubt. But don't forget, you're speaking to a bloke who spent 3.5 years thinking that, although he was fairly certain the Emperor was naked, all the people insisting that he wasn't meant that I entertained the notion of a flesh-coloured body stocking. It's hard to see how else this can play out, isn't it, now? 500 quid is not 5,000 quid, full stop, but he'll probably just waltz off over the horizon being all charming.
Well, I hope the listeners on LBC fully understand that he's done it before and he's done it deliberately.
Well, we need to double-check. I mean, well, triple-check, I suppose. We've spoken to the council, we've checked the documentation, you've heard him say it before, we've played out the clip where he said 5,000. I guess we'll put a call into Downing Street, will we? Try and get a steer on that? Thank you, Lewis. Paul's in Liverpool. Paul, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think we're through the looking glass. And we're in an age now where what's the point in telling the truth?
Yeah.
Why would you try and stand up and tell the truth when it's demonstrably true that you can say what you want and get away with it? And
get cheered. Get cheered as well. You know, I mean, we're a little short of Boris supporters on the programme today, but and the one that we did find was reduced to claiming that he hadn't actually listened to much of the interview, which I suppose is one way to hang on to positivity. But I'm with you, and I spotted this after Brexit. I said, if we don't call this out now, and calling it out now will involve pointing out to people that they've been lied to and they're not going to like it, then I can't see where it goes except up. It escalates. You could imagine a meeting, Paul, and they say, well, we can't do that. It's absolute nonsense. And then Dominic Cummings turns around and says, excuse me, do you remember my bus? And then they'll crack on with the tactic because it so demonstrably works.
I think the thing I really enjoyed about the climate debate last night, which didn't come across properly, was the fact they had fact-checkers there.
Yeah, we had one for this as well. I think it's...
I'd love to see them have a big buzzer, and when they go on TV or they go on the radio and they say something that's not true, you hit the buzzer. You say, try that again, say something that's actually true. And until the point where we have that, we have people actually held to account, why shouldn't he say whatever he wants? Because his job, as far as he sees it, is to get into power and to win an election.
To get over the line.
To do that.
To whatever it takes to get over the line. We're back to my PlayStation analogy. 3 types of people, Paul. People who could never, ever, ever cheat. They'd rather lose than cheat. People who could never, ever, ever not cheat. They'd rather cheat than lose. And then people who might cheat, but if they did, their conscience would call after them so loudly that eventually it would knock all the gloss off the joy of victory. I'll leave you to decide what category the current Prime Minister is in.
He wins. He wants to win, and he can win by doing what he wants and saying what he wants, and no one holds him to account. Why shouldn't he?
If you were to just turn yourself off and on again, could you see anything from that hour that is a cause for hope or positivity?
In the election campaign?
No, just in the interview earlier.
I can see, that obviously LBC and Nick this morning did try to hold them to account. However, as popular as the show is and as popular as the station is, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the mainstream media, who will obviously go with the same old things.
And also an awful lot of people are still barking up that entirely wrong tree about Johnson being filmed miming the throat-cutting action, which I can categorically tell you was simply him mimicking what Nick Ferrari was doing at the time, because I don't know how many of my viral clips you've had the pleasure of watching. We all do that. If we don't, it's called run our own faders, as it were. I don't like to run my own faders because sometimes the producers quite rightly think that they should leave callers on for a little bit longer than perhaps I want them to. But most other presenters do their own faders. And when you're not doing your own faders, which means you're not controlling your own calls, then the way to say to the producer, can we move on to a new one now, is to mime a throat-cutting action, which is what Nick was doing in the studio, which Boris Johnson copied, which got caught on camera, and which everybody is now claiming is something that it just isn't. Look, no one would be shouting it louder than me if he had been caught in some hugely embarrassing faux pas, but I promise you he wasn't. Paul, thank you.
I'm a Boris fan.
Yes.
And
why?
Everyone's got a past, and I think people have got it in for him a little bit at the moment.
So what would you say to them to show them the error of their ways? What would you point at as his sort of crowning glories?
Well, I just think he's being natural, and he's doing a good job.
Yeah, then it'll be easy to come up with some evidence.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you've got to give the guy a chance, haven't you? I mean, at the end of the day, more voted out than voted in, and I don't even know why we're having this discussion.
Well, it's because you rang the radio station, Matthew, with your phone.
Right, but we all voted out.
Yes, you're a Boris fan, you said. I'd like to know why.
Well, because I just like his personality, and I think he's.
But as a prime minister, what do you admire about him? What would you point if somebody sceptical listening to this said, "Well, give me some arguments, some points I can make next time I'm having a political discussion"?
I just see him as a stronger leader.
Yes, and the evidence for that is.
Well, just personal opinion.
No, but what's he done to inform that opinion?
Well, I mean, he's not really been in the job that long, has he?
Well, then we can go for the 8 years he was Mayor of London, if you want. You live in town.
Well, you could also say the same about Sadiq Khan. I mean, Sadiq Khan is...
But we're not, are we? We're talking about you being a fan of Boris Johnson and me saying why. So why would you answer that question with Sadiq Khan? That doesn't make any sense at all.
You've kind of got me there, but...
I haven't got you at all. I'm just waiting for you to give me one reason to admire Boris Johnson from his record.
Well, I just think this morning with Nick Ferrari...
Yes.
Who's a brilliant presenter,
yes.
Like yourself.
I agree. Well, no, I agree with the first bit. I also agree with the second bit, but I didn't mean to say that out loud.
Yeah.
But don't wriggle off the hook. What did he do or say that you can point to fairly unequivocally as evidence of his qualities?
I just think overall, in that hour that he was on LBC this morning, he defended himself impeccably.
Well, give me the bit you thought was impeccable, because he was wrong about... He didn't know how many trade negotiations he had going on. He was wrong about the amount of compensation that was given to people who'd been flooded. He refused to answer the question of how many children he's got. I could go on, but I won't, because that's not fair. Just give me one thing to put on the other side of the scales that he handled really well.
I just think overall, he was kind of attacked and put to challenge.
What challenge do you think he dealt with well?
Well, just overall, I don't know.
But just give me one example, Matthew. You're on national radio, bigging up the guy, and we're short of admirers, so just give us the sort of, evidence.
I'm not sure, James.
Okay, mate. That's fair enough. That's fair enough. So you're a big fan, you just don't know why.
Well, there you go. You're clearly more of a Corbyn man, aren't you?
Well, you clearly don't listen to my programme, Matthew. It's not a football match, mate. It's not a question of picking a side and then defending it. I'm you could probably describe me as one of Corbyn's harshest critics. I know that his closest advisors do, so leave me out of it. Back to you. You're a big fan of Boris, but you can't think of a single reason why.
All right, mate. Listen, have a nice weekend.
And you, Matthew. Take this up to 12, I think, and then take a view. We may talk about something else, possibly something light-hearted, if you can think of anything. It'd be quite nice to ease our way towards the weekend after I hand you over to Sheila Fogarty with an hour of relative fun, although there's not a lot to laugh about on the political landscape at the moment. I just sort of play you a little clip of Boris Johnson's dad this morning that may be illustrative of a broader truth. It may not, but it is interesting, to say the least.
Again, another point that was made in the comments there from viewers, somebody calling your son Pinocchio. I know that you responded to these allegations of lying before.
Literacy, which I think the great British public doesn't necessarily have. And I went...
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
I'm not going to get into that.
Well, that's quite a pejorative thing to say about the great British public.
They couldn't spell Pinocchio if they tried, I should have thought.
Why would you say that? Why do you...
What, can you spell Pinocchio?
11:37 is the time. 1N, 2 Cs, I think. Mike's in Bolton. Mike, what did you make of that interview? What did you make of the Prime Minister?
Hi, James. Well, can I first say that I don't find you patronising. I think you're amazing.
Well, give me a chance. Give me a chance, sweet cheeks.
The best thing about you is that you get to your callers, you justify everything you say, and you get your callers to do the same. And when they can't, which is more often than not, that it makes great radio. Yeah. He had a difficult time. I love the idea that he's tried to avoid Andrew Neil when he thought this is like a better option, and I don't think it went very well for him, to be honest. Right. You've actually just touched on some of the things I was about to say, but he just several times I found him saying like I don't have the figures, and I can't comment about nurses, about hospitals. He sort of gives you the bold head.
Trade negotiations, trade agreements.
Yeah, when you look, exactly, his own children.
And then when he did give a figure, it turns out we think, and I really stress that we could be wrong. We might be barking up the wrong tree, but he seems to have got it wrong by a factor of 10. The amount of compensation given to flood victims.
Yeah, he comes out with the main headline, and then when you look at the details, you go, yeah, that's not really what the headline says, is it? So he always has to backpedal sort of thing. So yeah, even, like I said, with his own children, it's like, ask me now how many children I have, James.
How many children do you have, Mike?
I've got 2 children, very proud of them, they're lovely sort of thing, hashtag me too, that's a different movement. But yeah, it's like, why can't you just answer the question?
Ask me how many children I've got, Mike.
How many children do you have, James?
2, Mike.
Brilliant, I'll snap. Thanks,
yeah, it's quite easy, really. I don't mean, why would that be difficult?
His is Achilles heel, or one of them anyway.
Doesn't matter.
One of many. The other thing, the Russian report, right? So he's several times now. We found he's chose to sort of say, "Oh, there's nothing to hide. There's nothing to hide." Honestly, there's nothing, and people keep saying to him, "Then publish it. Just release it, then," sort of thing. And to me, it's like, I won't ask you if you've ever heard the theory that well-endowed men like to hang out at nudist beaches, because obviously I saw you there last weekend. I picture Boris. I picture Boris sitting on the outskirts of the beach, and they're going, "Come on, Boris," and he's going. He sat out like a rubbish Mr. T, going, "I ain't going on no beach." And it's like, Boris, we've heard you've got a big document. Why don't you show us? Why don't you release it? And they're like, and he's like, it's heavily redacted. I'm like, yeah, and it's cold.
Very cold. It's very cold.
You know what I mean? Yeah, so it's like, show us, just show us.
Stop it now. You're worrying me. You're sailing close. You're sailing close to the wind. Any positives? I mean this. It sounds like I'm being glib, but I would like to know whether or not you kind of saw anything. But I mean, it's embarrassing, because I've had a couple of callers who liked him. One didn't know why, and the other ended up saying he hadn't really heard the interview. So, okay, I'll ask you a different question. I'll ask you.
All politicians lie. That's not. You don't justify his lying as well. Everyone does it.
I know, but that's Donald Trump's. That's the Donald Trump defence as well.
Yeah.
But her emails.
Mog. I have to touch on Mog.
Quickly.
He's been hiding recently.
Have you seen him? Is he in Bolton? He might be in Bolton.
No, he's not. Did you see the
check around the back of the octagon? Check around the back of the octagon. He might be hiding there.
They mirrored an article the other day, and they dressed it up as, they didn't say it, but they dressed it up as like, "Where's Wally?" basically. Because it's like, "Where's Mog? We can't find him anywhere." And he's got like a "Where's Wally?" esque sort of look to him and that. But yeah, I love the idea of the Tories going, "Oh, let's just keep it on at the moment."
I mean, the question I would ask is the one about whether it makes the blindest bit of difference to anyone. But I know what you'd say, and Rees-Mogg is quite an interesting example, because I think the big problem is working out whether the fences for people who are incapable of thinking. They are literally, bless him. I think Mike in Hampton and I parted as friends, but by being a robust critic of Boris Johnson, Mike couldn't quite compute the idea that doesn't mean that you're a fan and admirer of Jeremy Corbyn. And this is no criticism of Mike. Good God, the effort that's been put into leading him to this horrible place is immense. It's decades. You don't have to pick one. You can be equally unimpressed by both of them, but Mike doesn't get it, which is how you end up not being able to get out of your pen. And I don't know how many people are in that pen. That's the problem. Because if you're in the pen, presumably you still don't think Jacob Rees-Mogg is a liability, even though Boris Johnson almost certainly does. It's the only available explanation for why he's been locked in a coffin since he made his despicable comments about Grenfell Tower. So you have this bizarre scenario where literally the Fifth Avenue observation can be applied to British policies, but you've got no way of knowing. I used to think that social media was misleading on that. I used to think social media provided a disproportionate representation to people who couldn't change their mind if their life depended on it, whose football scarf is welded, not just wrapped to their neck. Now, well, I think there's loads of them. Loads more than perhaps we realised. I think Brexit probably has created millions because it's left millions of people with a simple choice. Do you admit that you made a mistake that you didn't need to make and that lots of people pointed out at the time was a mistake, or do you close your eyes, put your fingers in your ears and start screaming your head off about how deeply and profoundly you support the fella who told you Brexit was a good idea? And, of course, if you've decided to put your fingers in your ears, close your eyes and start screaming your support for the fellow who told you that Brexit was a good idea, the worst thing anybody can do is ask you what it is about him that you like. And that is where the media, perhaps, has a lot of very difficult questions to answer. Mike, what a cracking call. Thank you. Andy's in Mill Hill. Andy, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello,
absolutely fantastic show. I've been listening all morning, including the whole hour of Nick Ferrari's interview. But what spurred me to actually pick up the phone and call in was that the caller you had, Alison, who was very upset about climate change.
Yeah.
Now, I just wanted to share the truth. The simple, unadulterated, incontrovertible truth about climate change. And it is simply this. Unless the United States, China and India adopt carbon-neutral policies, there's not a jot of difference we can do as a country. It's like Christmas shopping. You go out and spend £1,000 this Christmas buying gifts for loved ones, and then you pay the minimum balance. Next month, that credit card bill is going to be bigger.
I'm not sure she'd argue with that, would she?
So why waste your tears? Corbyn and Labour Party...
Well, I think the short answer would be the document. I'm sure you've seen the bit of the document that Jeremy Corbyn and Barry Gardiner were waving around the other day, and it says we're not even allowed to mention climate change during negotiations with America.
We've actually been through all 471 pages, including all manifestos, because I work in financial services, and
but then you've seen the line I'm referring to. So if you, I mean, I think you're in good faith, but. And Alison's obviously not here to explain herself. I found her position easier to understand, perhaps, than your contribution currently allows. But if we are going to surrender our concerns about climate change on the altar of a trade deal with America, then your point adds to her reasons to be fearful.
Certainly not saying surrendering at the altar of America. I'm saying that we are absolutely powerless to stop this unless much larger and hell-bent.
But that's going to make her. That's not going to stop her crying. That's going to make her cry more when she reads the minutes of the negotiations with America and reads the bit where it says you're not even allowed to mention climate change in the context of our trade negotiations.
Well, following that argument of reasoning,
it's not an argument of reasoning, mate. It's a statement of fact.
So therefore, take Channel 4's debate. I mean, I looked at that and worked through the maths. We're talking about planting 770 trees per second for the entire life of the Parliament in order to meet the pledge of planting 2 billion trees. I mean, that's just not possible.
Well, it just sounds fairly unlikely to me, but I'm not quite sure what axe it is that you're grinding. You're saying that because there's no point doing anything because other people aren't doing more.
The point I'm trying to make is that every single manifesto has been somewhat economical with the truth, and this election has...
But that's not the point you made. The point you made was that there's no point trying to address climate change unless... I mean, India at the moment is, and China actually, are breaking records in some areas of environmental provision. So let's put it in a sentence. Alison, don't worry about the future of climate change because...
Because unless we can actually negotiate at a table with these much bigger emitters.
No, but we can't, because that's in the negotiation
document. And that is entirely my point.
So
really
she shouldn't worry about climate change because...
Well, I only tend to worry about things I can influence or control. I mean, you know...
Really?
Sorry?
Really?
Well, I mean, yes.
So you don't follow sport then?
Sorry?
You don't follow sport at all?
I do follow sport.
How do you influence that?
How do I influence that personally?
Yeah.
Well, I'm actually a supply league referee, so I'm right in the middle of the pitch making decisions.
But the sport you support, how do you influence it?
I don't influence by support.
So it's a stupid thing to say. You're not concerned about things you can't personally influence. That's ridiculous.
No, I'm a big fan of a London football club that just sacked their manager. I'm not worried about it because another manager's going to come along tomorrow.
Yeah, OK. Thanks for the call, Andy. 10 more minutes of our post-mortem of the Boris Johnson interview. I think I might have found some light on that £500 versus £5,000. £500 compensation available to people whose houses were damaged by floods, but there is up to £5,000 available in grants for improvements designed to protect flood-hit homes and businesses from future flooding. So I leave you to decide where you think the light lies on that. Let's listen to the clip again, shall we? Let's just listen to it again, because a couple of callers convinced that he's been perpetrating this repeatedly, and I said I can't quite believe that, because this one is too obvious if it is a deliberate deceit.
What I will say is that this government has stood ready, done everything we can to help the victims of flooding, both in our community support schemes, our business support schemes. We have £5,000 available for every household that's been damaged.
Don't know that that's actually true, but for my money, that's a forgivable mistake. There is not £5,000 available for every household that's been damaged. There is £500 available for every household that's been damaged. But for very, very damaged households and businesses, there is up to £5,000. Well, this sounds like I'm doing his PR for him. But there is up to £5,000 available in grants, not as compensation, but as an investment in protections from future flooding. So you can shoot me down in flames if you want, but I don't think that was deceitful. I think he's wrong, but I think it was an accident, all right? And I do have to also tell you that the bit where he's pushing his hand across his throat in the ancient gesture is not what many people are claiming. Neither, actually, I've just seen Nick's tweeted about it. We obviously operate our studio slightly differently, so he does the throat-cutting gesture when he's telling his producer to shut up. I never tell my producer to shut up because shush, I'm trying to talk. Because the line of thought that you need on air sometimes can be distracted by the voice of geniuses in your headphones. So and Nick does his own faders on the phones. So what he was doing was saying to the producer, stop talking in my ear. And we all do that, although I sense that is going to be a form of dead feline that will never get off the table. Let's go to Oxford. Kevin's there. Kevin, what would you like to say?
I think Boris did a job there with his interview.
Hang on, mate. We're just going to have to improve your phone line. I'll be right back. Mark is in Didsbury. Mark, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How you doing?
I'm all good, Mark. What's on your mind?
So, I'm listening to Johnson's comments about that flooding and the £5,000 per household can't be right. I'm an insurance broker, don't laugh.
No, I'm not laughing. I'm just thinking. I wasn't laughing at your job, mate. I was just thinking. I was about to question your credentials. I was laughing at myself for not having jumped in like I usually do, like a dog with a bone, and gone, "How do you know? How do you know?" Carry on.
So if your house gets damaged and you're insured, and you get £5,000 more than it costs to repair, that's called betterment, so the insurance companies wouldn't pay the claim properly. It's total fabrication.
So if there was £5,000 compensation available from the government, then the insurance companies would
just take it, yeah. They would pay the bill and say, well,
but do you not think, crikey, how does this happen? I end up batting for Boris Blinking Johnson.
Can I just jump in?
Of course you can.
You do that. The real scandal in all of this, and what nobody's talking about, is about 7 or 8 years ago, the ABI, which is Association of British Insurers, went to the government and said, unless you do these flood defence programme that we have done for you, we've outlined what to do, we are going to withdraw flood risk in certain areas of the country.
Blimey.
The government didn't do it. The insurance company stopped offering flood cover, and the government had to set up what's called Flood Re. So they are now carrying the can, which cost much more than the flood defence work did. And these people that are living in areas that are subject to flooding, the government let them down, and the industry that's responsible for protecting them told them that that's what they were going to do.
What rationale would the government have been employing, do you think, in that? Short-term saving, regardless of the long-term cost?
Typical Tory
well, not just Tory. I mean, there's plenty of other political parties that...
Jam today.
Slippy leaves, Mark. Do you know why you just made me think of slippy leaves?
Why is that?
I hope you like this. I bought some new shoes recently.
Right.
I bought my grown-up shoes. So I don't do telly really anymore. So I don't need suits and grown-up shoes. But every now and then I've got to go somewhere where I've got to look smart. So I bought some new shoes. And instead of getting the posh shoes I used to get with a leather sole, I found some rather nice Chelsea boots with quite a chunky rubber sole. And I really...
You're getting old.
I am getting old. But I really noticed how much less slippy it was on the wet leaves. And then I clocked that the pavements are looking a lot more leafy than they usually do. And my mother-in-law and her partner were both talking at the weekend about how hazardous they're finding it getting around at the moment because of the leaves. And I suddenly realised that the councils have probably cut leaf clearing, but in the bigger picture, by the time you factor in the NHS costs of treating people and dealing with people who've had falls on pavements made slippy by leaves, it's going to cost a fortune.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like the whole prescription thing. You know, taking out the human element of it. In Scotland, prescriptions are free, so people don't show up at casualty who have been trying to skimp on asthma inhalers and end up in comas, costing the NHS hundreds of thousands of pounds. That's the basic of every cut that's been made. It doesn't even make financial sense. It's all driven by ideology, not a very nice one.
No.
Nothing to do with money.
You may well be right, and I shall let you have the slippy leaves for future insurance broker conferences. It's 11:57, like he doesn't already know that, but it was a bit of a revelation to me. One more call. Alex is in Hitchin. Alex, what would you like to say?
Hello. I don't know how you knew I was in Hitchin, but yeah, I'm near there.
Good.
First-time caller.
Very welcome.
So, thank you. And I just wanted to say that my opinion on the interview with Boris by Nick earlier on, I thought Nick did a great job.
Me too, absolutely.
But I think your political correspondent, Theo Usherwood, made a good point earlier in the week that what Boris Johnson is saying about the NHS could well be technically true.
Yes.
Because he's saying it's not up for sale. But the point I'd really like clarification on is how drug prices will be affected during trade negotiations to see whether or not US pharma companies would potentially have more access to sell drugs in the UK.
And this is why
prices are actually higher in the US.
Considerably higher. And this is and Donald Trump's claim is that American consumers would pay less if foreign consumers of American drugs were somehow compelled to pay more. That's a big part of his if it can be called a policy on health. But are they mutually exclusive, do you think? You can say categorically and honestly that the NHS is not for sale, but somehow the American rules regarding patent licenses and drug costs would be inflicted upon us under the terms of any trade deal. Could they both be true? Could you sustain both simultaneously?
I'm not sure, actually. It's a good question. But I think that, I think it's well known that increasing the life of patents will potentially increase prices.
Potentially? Not potentially. I mean, categorically, as far as I'm aware.
Well, yeah, I guess so.
And that's the thing you want him pushed on. But I mean, I appreciate you're not criticising Nick. If I were to imagine myself in those scenarios, I don't think... I mean, you push him to the point where he blusters or says something funny or stroke rude. The absolute absence of detail, it's almost becoming a selling point to his fans.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would even say my next point would be on new hospitals. This is where I think he was disingenuous, actually. And I agree with your point earlier around almost lying on this, because he's patronising people, actually, speaking of anyone patronising anyone.
Yes.
Because he said, in his view, new hospitals are old ones that are refreshed or rebuilt. But he knows full well that people think when he says new hospitals, that means more hospitals.
Same with new nurses. Does not mean current nurses who stay a bit longer than they were originally planning to. I don't understand that either, actually, but I don't think there is any prospects of hitting pay dirt if you pursue him on those issues, but I could be wrong. I obviously relish the opportunity to find out. Alex, thank you so much. I'll read this from Anne because it made me chuckle. In a nice way, Anne, please don't take offence. Disappointed in you defending Johnson today, James. When you're Prime Minister, you have to be very careful what you say to voters who've had their homes flooded. There are no excuses. Also, even if Ferrari did do a throat cut for the producer, why on earth would Johnson copy it? Wrong, James. He's pointing out that no matter what you think you're hearing on the radio, other people will be hearing something completely different.